I'm going to wait a few more seconds as folks log on, and then we will go ahead and begin.
You'll see me don and doff my glasses. I had cataract surgery this last month. I've had both eyes fixed.
So did my dad. Wow.
That means you can see perfectly now.
Well, I can see like a person who needs readers, but
jealous someday.
Oh my goodness. Well, let's go ahead and begin. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first Faith and Culture Conversations at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. My name is Kelly Cooper, and I serve as the Minister for Faith Formation, and we are so glad that you have joined us. This series came out of a discussion from our 2021 Lenten Lecture Series this past Lent, where we formatted things on a webinar, and we felt like it worked really well. And so now we're hoping to offer a monthly opportunity to discuss various topics of the intersection of faith and culture. It is my pleasure to introduce our two co-hosts for this series. The first is David Coogan. He is an associate professor of English at VCU, specializing in rhetoric, the teaching of writing, as well as prison literature. Our second co-host is Christine Luckritz Marquis. She is an associate professor of church history at Union Presbyterian Seminary and is also the program director of the Master of Theology program. She teaches and focuses on her expertise exploring early Christian communities and their practices. So again, we are so glad that you all are here today. We will do a brief presentation, and then we will also have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. If you have any questions throughout the time, you can feel free to add them into the Q&A button below. And now I will pass things over to Dave and Christine.
Hey, well, thanks everybody. Thank you for being here. Welcome to our little space on the internet. I hope you enjoy your time here with us. I want to say a little bit about the Faith and Culture series, and then I want to introduce our guest, and then we're going to get into this dialogue. In the Bible, we know faith is, quote, the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things that are not seen. That's from Hebrews. Culture, by contrast, is known in what we can see, the customs, the arts, institutions, and other achievements of a particular group, nation, or people. Clearly, faith and culture intersect, but how and toward what end? Can multiple faiths and cultures exist side by side in a public life in which everyone can flourish? Okay, that is the overview. That is what we're getting into in this series. And tonight we're kicking off that series a few days after the National Indigenous Peoples Day. So we are a few days late, but I hope not too late to get into the dialogue about how faith and culture intersect in reference to that recent holiday. And with us to celebrate and get into the dialogue is Stephen Adkins. He is the chief of the Chickahominy Tribe and has been since 2001. As the leader of one of the first contact tribes in Virginia, his voice and representation of his community are crucial to larger discussions around faith in Virginia. In recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day, he will be sharing his own understanding of faith and culture, including how he understands his faith and has experienced it in light of new experiences. As a longtime advocate for his people, Chief Adkins will share how federal recognition of the Chickahominy and neighboring Virginia tribes in 2018 has shifted his relationship to surrounding culture and what new is on the horizon for the Chickahominy in relation to other peoples in Virginia. Welcome, Chief Adkins.
thank you for that very kind introduction. I must say I'm humbled to be able to share my story with you today. You know, many times I've lamented the fact that our story has not been told. So I took a look in the mirror one day and I said, well, if your story is not being told, why don't you tell it? And I've been on a mission ever since then to share my story. And I hope at some point the Department of Education will recognize the fact that a Eurocentric narrative doesn't tell the story of Virginia's peoples. I'll back up a tad. people look at the Chickahominy tribe and they'll ask these sometimes nuanced questions about culture and religion. And to the some folks, when they hear the question, they're assuming that the questioner doesn't realize that our people are Christians. And I'll tell you about the miracle of that, but I'll back up a little bit. The College of William and Mary unearthed an ossuary, which is a mass grave, on the banks of the Chickahominy. And they were Chickahominy people. And with some trepidation, we allowed a bone fragment to be analyzed, and it was dated 600 AD. So 600 AD, that'll give you a sense of the footprint that we've had in this area for many years. So 1452 was a critical time for all indigenous peoples across the globe, those outside of England, I should say outside of Europe. But Pope Nicholas V issued a papal bull known as the Doctrine of Discovery or Manifest Destiny. He issued it to King Ferdinand V of Portugal. And that bull gave them the right to discover, quote unquote, undiscovered lands and to take the lands for themselves. And this was given by the Christian church. And soon the rest of Europe became a little upset. So he extended that decree to all of Europe. So against that backdrop, it's a miracle that the Chickahominy tribe are Christian people. And we are. The church has been the focal point of our community for many years. So the survival struggle of my people, the Chickahominy, and indigenous people across the globe began at the hands of the church. If I fast forward to 1607, the settlers landed in what is present day Jamestown. They came ashore May the 14th, 1607. There were upwards of 35 tribes in Tidewater, Virginia at that time. And I've said there was a brief honeymoon period there. The Chickahominy was one of the tribes that actually helped the settlers survive in a climate that was pretty harsh, an environment that was pretty harsh and very alien to them. So we helped them survive, but the honeymoon didn't last long because the settlers were armed with the Doctrine of Discovery and they were seeking to gain land. In 1610, Lord Delaware, who was the titular head of the head of the Jamestown settlement, ordered the militia to wipe out the Paspahegh tribe, who had the dubious distinction of living closest to Jamestown. He feared the tribe would rise up against the colony and would overtake them. So the militia was dispatched, and they went out to the Paspahegh settlement. The chief and several of the males were out on a hunting party, but they did annihilate all the people that they could. They decided to take the wife of the chief back to Jamestown and two pre-adolescent boys. But on the way back, they kind of got cold feet because they were advised very strictly not to bring back any hostages. So they threw the two boys out into the river, and the writer says that they blew their brains out with their muskets. And they actually took the queen ashore. They called her the queen, and they got to deliberating among themselves. If we take her to Jamestown Fort, they will burn her at stake. So they decided to dispatch with her more humanely, and they ran her through with a sword. So I'll lift that up because if you fast forward to 1776, the Declaration of Independence, one of the things that was lifted up is that these savages, their methods of warfare didn't discriminate against killing women and children. I would like to inform Thomas Jefferson that template was set many years before 1776, and it was set by the European invaders. And I lift it up because there are so many facets of history that have not been taught, and the only people that actually know that are those who dig through and try to understand the reality that existed in the early 17th century. In 1614, the Chickahominy Tribe negotiated a treaty with the colonists where we said that we would give them 350 to 500 bowmen in the event of an attack by the Spaniards or enemy tribes. So conventional wisdom at the time said for every bowman, there were 3 to 5 regular citizens. So you can do the math. We were a pretty substantial tribe. Today we have 1,183 tribal citizens on roll. So this kind of set the stage, that Treaty of 1614, for a peaceful assembly that occurred in 1619 when the first English-speaking representative government was seated in what is now the Commonwealth of Virginia, and it's been reputed to be the first one in all of what we call Turtle Island, which is now the United States. So that treaty, I mean, that representative government met, and the term representative is used rather loosely because it only spoke to men who own land. But a scant 27 years later, the General Assembly met and the Treaty of 1646 was formed. And that treaty ordered my people, the Chickahominy Tribe, to move from the banks of the Chickahominy to a place called, today it's Alet, in King and Queen County, King William County. And we were put on a reservation with one of the tribes over there. I'm sure all of you have heard of the Trail of Tears. So that was 1830. What I'm telling you today is a template for that forced removal was set in 1646. By then, the representative government that was tantamount, I reckon, to Parliament within the colonies. So, and that treaty required us to give up all of our guns, and it required us to dress in a certain way when we left the reservation if we had to go, to some other area for whatever reason. And if we didn't wear that distinctive clothing, the colonists were given free rein to shoot us on sight. And part of that treaty, we would give the governor 20 beaver skin each year at the going away of the geese. In 1677, the Articles of Peace, or the Treaty of Middle Plantation, was signed in what's present day Williamsburg. And it called us sovereign subjects of the crown. Now that's a contradiction in terms. How can you be sovereign and subject?
Right.
But it did call us sovereign subjects of the crown. And we did sign a treaty that would govern the way we live going forward. The irony is that the settlers, which has been a kind of their MO throughout the history of treaties, they didn't live up to the rights of, to what the treaties we had agreed to on the treaty. One provision was that no settlers would take land north of what they call the York River. I still call it the monkey. They named it after some nondescript person called York. But anyway, before the ink dried, people had self-settlement at what we call today Gloucester Point. So, I mentioned earlier that excerpt from the Declaration of Independence, where he said he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us as endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So I bring that to you so you can see how the purest thoughts are juxtaposed against the reality of what occurred back in 1610. So if if you move forward to 1776, when the American Revolution actually occurred, and that Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain rights, which include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And for many years I've read that, and I lamented the fact that those rights weren't really extended to me, nor were they extended to other people of color. And it's a very lofty statement, that opening statement, but it wasn't something by which the United States lived in. I'm confident we're working toward that more perfect union, that statement that was written into the Constitution. And I think it's a journey that we're taking together, and it may always be a journey. We may never reach perfection, but I think that should be our goal. So in 1787, I think it was September 17th, 1787, the Constitution of the United States was finally accepted by the delegates. Ironically, Virginia wasn't one of the states that signed it with those early signers. I think Virginia signed it in 1788. But that Constitution, in my view, it's a great document. Even though some facets of it, were denied to people like me for many years. Back during Prohibition, several white people, their homes were invaded, and their liquor was taken, and they cited unlawful search and seizure, and that they were protected by the Constitution. And then if you look at the 14th Amendment, I believe it's equal protection under the law. So both of these, the 4th Amendment and 14th Amendment, are very powerful statements, but it didn't extend to me. Unlawful search and seizure and equal protection under the law were elusive aspirational goals of my people for many years, and other people of color. So that was 1787. In 1806, Lewis and Clark were dispatched by Thomas Jefferson to explore, to go west. And it's not explicitly stated, or it may be, but his goal was to take more land from the indigenous people. And at every place they stopped, they would set up, or many places where they stopped, they would set up a fort. Everything beyond that was the frontier. I've begun to hate that term, because what it says is where a white man's foot stopped, that's where the frontier began, despite the fact that people like me were living beyond that point and worried about what was going to happen as the land hungry folks continue to move forward. And I told you about the Trail of Tears, but I want to back up a minute, because I think the fact that I'm a Christian and that the majority of the Virginia Indians are Christians, I think it's a miracle from God. I think despite the fact that the church issued this papal bull, and it came out under the leadership of the Christian church, we could see beyond that, and the word of God, the word of the Lord Jesus Christ in the New Testament just reached up and grabbed us, and we were convinced that when he gave his life, he gave it for us. So despite the reality in which we live, we believe that Christ died for our sins. So I'm a Christian. I happen to be a Baptist. I suspect, I'm glad my parents were Christians. Had they been another faith, who knows where I would be today. But I am a Christian. And even if you look at the book of Romans, it talks about people, there's no excuse for denying the existence of our Creator, the Creator that we call God. So I think perhaps I was even covered before I actually heard of Christ. We could deliberate that on another day. But I'll back up a tad and tell you why I think it's such a miracle that we are Christians. In 1823, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Johnson versus McIntosh that the discovery rights of European sovereigns had been transferred to the new United States. And John Marshall said, and I'll quote, that colonists acquire territory on this continent under the principle of the right of discovery of countries then unknown to all Christian people. So that was just carte blanche. I mean, carte blanche. Any countries that hadn't been, quote, discovered, unquote, by Christians was fair game. He said, this is a right to take possession, notwithstanding the occupancy of the natives who were heathens, and at the same time admitting the prior title of any Christian people who may have made the previous discovery. And that word discovery kind of rankles me too. But he said Christian discovery into US law, he was emphatic in adopting that into US law. He said the United States then have unequivocally acceded to that great and broad rule by which its civilized inhabitants now hold this country. And I kind of cringe a little bit at civilized. How these people came and mercilessly killed us and took our land. And we were the savages. There's kind of a disconnect there, but again, we won't quibble over that at this point. And I'll give you Associate Justice Joseph Story. He was a Unitarian, 1779 through 1845. But listen to what he wrote. He said the title of the Indians was not treated as a right of propriety and dominion, but as a mere right of occupancy. As infidels, heathens, and savages, they were not allowed to possess the prerogatives belonging to absolute, sovereign, and independent nations. The territory over which they wanted and which they used for their temporary and fugitive purposes was, in respect to Christians, deemed as if it were inhabited only by brute animals. So I would say all of you within earshot, can agree with me that it's a miracle, a testimony to the power of God's word, that I'm a Christian, despite how the deck was stacked against us for all of those years. So I'm gonna fast forward to the 18th century, and by 1792, many of my people had come back to Charles City, Canada, to a place called Chickahominy Ridge. And again, another miracle ensued. We were buying land fee simple, which was totally unheard of. We reorganized to our present governance structure in 1901. So let me give you a little background. Prior to that, we were ruled by or governed by kind of a council, and was called Mungai. And the women in the tribe would select young adolescent males, and they go through a very rigorous training regimen. And it was both physical and mental training, very rigorous. And some people didn't make the cut, and those that didn't weren't banned or ostracized, but most of them didn't come back to the village or the town, I think out of shame. So we reorganized in 1901, and we adopted a system of elections every 4 years. And we elect the chief, the assistant chief, and all the officers, and then council members. And by the way, we don't have an electoral college. We think every vote counts, and it should be attributed to the person who signed the ballot. So again, we can talk about that later. So our governance structure in 1901, elected every 4 years. And I think I've forgotten when Walter Ashby Flecker was born, but Walter Ashby Flecker came on the scene in 1924. He put forth the Racial Integrity Act, which said that any person who had one drop of non-white blood was colored. And that included white people who had everything except one drop of white blood. And it's ironic because the same year that the Indians were given citizenship is when he wrote this Racial Integrity Act. A sad commentary is the church didn't stand up and support it. The church went along with it. Yeah. The universities, colleges and universities supported this. The executive branch, the judiciary, the legislature supported it. No one stood in the gap for us. Adolf Hitler praised the work of Walter Ashby Flecker.
Yep.
And said it should be a model that all countries use. My great uncle served in World War One, and when he was discharged, he had to write a little narrative about his experience. And one of the compelling statements he wrote was that while I'm not a citizen of these United States, I'm a citizen of the land, and I'm proud to have fought to protect this land. I mean, I can stop for a moment if you have any questions, and I don't have much more to go, but are there questions about what I've said thus far?
Well, I wanted to, I just have to tell you, this warms my historian heart. I am very passionate, and the reason I ended up doing history and stopping being pre-med very long ago was I was very interested in like the stories that weren't getting told in Christian history. So I really appreciate that. And I know you mentioned very briefly the sort of ways in which the Chickahominy came to be predominantly Christian. And I know that there is a Baptist church that many of your people belong to, yes?
Right,
The Samaria.
Yeah, Samaria, like the Samaritans in the Bible.
Yes, no, I caught that. And so I wanted to sort of, in light of hearing these struggles and finding yourself in a position where you're narrating so passionately the sort of stories of the ways in which the church has not treated your people well, even when they're Christian, and the ways in which other Christians have not treated them well. I just wondered if you have ever struggled to sort of reconcile your faith with this sort of history that you're simultaneously narrating and sometimes still very actively advocating for. I mean, federal recognition is very recent, in under 4 years. So,
well, it's for me, it's not a complex answer, and it goes back to what I iterated earlier. The New Testament, the Old Testament notwithstanding, but is very compelling. And when you read about Christ and you read about the apostles, you know, how Peter stood up, how I think one of the Pauline letters said, there's neither Jew nor Gentile, there's neither slave nor free, we're all God's people. I hearken back to the Old Testament where the Bible says we were made in God's image, created in God's image. So from where I stand, when I look at the face of another human being, I'm looking at the face of God because we were made in God's image. When I read about the miracles Jesus performed, when I read about just the fact that he gave his life so that I could have access to eternal glory, that was enough for me. Now, the religion that we had, there were two gods, a kiss and a home. One was a good God, one was a bad God. So it was close to the Judeo-Christian religion, where we recognize God and we recognize the evil one that some call Satan, some call the devil. So if you put them together, it wasn't a big switch. So despite the actions of the people, which we understand actions speak louder than words, the word of God came through. And there were some people within the church who reached out and said, let me tell you about Christ. And this is really what it is. And as I said, the church has been a focal point of our community for many years. It was kind of the glue that held the tribe together. And I'm open for more questions. I can.
Yeah, I have one, Chief. I'm really compelled by the imagery that you used in your narration of the frontier, and you're recoiling at words like civilization and savage. And I imagine as you were speaking, what that would look like. Like you said, this is the furthest we got, and we made up our camp. And then at the border of where we had settled at the moment as the discoverers lay the wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought about that border as not just a physical border between two countries or two peoples, but the other meaning of frontier as like the limit of your own understanding or the limit of your own achievement. And if the culture, as you kind of described earlier, if the culture of the European mindset was the discoverer, the civilizer, or the claimer, and that culture was driven by the manifest destiny. What I'm thinking about now is what that must have been like at the border between the limit of that cultural achievement and what lay beyond it or on the other side of it. And I wondered if you might be interested in speculating what may have been in the minds of the settlers as they reached the frontier.
You know, I'll back up a bit and share what I think is in the mind of was in the mind of the people whose lands were being wrested from them. Word traveled. Folks don't understand there was a network among the tribes, and folks had seen what had gone on in what is present-day Virginia. They saw tribes that had been decimated. You know, by the end of by 1699, 9 out of 10 of the indigenous people in this area had perished, and there probably was a like number of settlers, but they had an inexhaustible supply coming from England. But I would say the settlers were just reaching out. I mean, they call them pioneers. Anyway, I call them land grabbers. But I think they were looking ahead and still searching for that mysterious pot of gold. For you know, the settlers came to a land, in my view, that was flowing with milk and honey, but they were advised that there were precious minerals to be discovered. There were tremendous natural resources, and I think like I said, we got to go further. We've got to avail ourselves of these riches that lay beyond where we are now. I mean, they surely at that point had enough land to develop a homestead and to live off the land, but there was a push for more and more. To say it earlier, I think they had an insatiable appetite for land.
Right. So it wasn't the Christianity that you're describing of eternal rest in the Lord. It wasn't the love of Christ. It was something else.
They weren't, you know, people love to say that the United States was founded on Christian principles. And I would have to agree. It was the Christian principles espoused by Pope Nicholas V and conveyed to King Ferdinand V of Portugal. So it was the Christian principles that they were espoused, but they weren't the principles that I've come to understand that were articulated by Jesus Christ.
Speaking of spiritual practice, Christine, did you notice in the questions we got some?
Yeah. So I had a question, and I wanted to sort of link it to one of the questions that someone has placed in the chat. So you had mentioned in your narration that how a lot of Indigenous peoples refer to this as Turtle Island, and it was later given this name, the United States, right? So that there is this sort of interplay around sort of things that come from your tradition and things that are part of your tradition as Christians, right? And how those sort of intersect. And so the question that was offered was, what traditions and rituals of your ancestors remain in practice? And are they in any way intertwined with your Christian faith? Because you've already sort of narrated for us that the sort of God-devil structures were very similar, right? The creator God of Ahona and the sort of Christian God the Father figure that you were being introduced to really sort of syncretized quite nicely. But are there any other sorts of practices or naming?
When the settlers arrived, they thought we were pagan worshipers worshiping the moon, the stars, the sun.
Yeah.
And we did have some dances that were tailored toward those celestial beings. We recognized the power of the moon. We planted our seeds by the cycle of the moon. The above ground plants at one point, and those below ground another point. We recognize the gravitational pull. We recognize the fact that the moon had on the tidal structure. So, in my view, we were dancing to the majesty of the Creator. Mm-hmm. We looked at the 4 cardinal directions, thinking that life began in the east, and then we looked north and south and west where the sun set, and in our circle of life. That's how we addressed it, but I don't see anything pagan in that, and it may be a very biased. Well, it is a very biased viewpoint that I had. And we had the green corn dance, which symbolized the fertility of the corn, of those crops as they began to mature. And then in the fall, we'd have a harvest dance. The Chickahominy began their fall festival and powwow many years ago. We broke off during the Second World War, started back again in 1951 and had it every year through 2019. And then this thing called the pandemic came in, so we didn't have one in 2020, nor did we have one in 2021. But again, we are just honoring our Creator for the boundaries that He's given us. And part of our calculus includes preserving, toward the environment, preserving the environment for the next 7 generations. And if for us Christians, 7, pretty significant number in the Bible. So I see a lot of connections, and as I said earlier, it was pretty well aligned with the Judeo-Christian experience. Other questions?
There's a related one that somebody raised in our Q&A about recent recognition of this history. The person writes, could you respond to recent widespread use of land acknowledgement by governments, organizations, and so on, including the College of William and Mary, which instituted related programs? Do you think this is significant or too little too late?
I think it's probably a gesture in the right direction. It doesn't move me a whole lot, to be truthful. I want to see textbooks reflect the accurate history. When I tell my story, I had a sister who died a tragic death with breast cancer. I lost 2 sisters, a brother, and a brother-in-law to cancer. And if I tell my story and I leave that out, they don't have the complete story of Steve Adkins. So history is all at once comedy and tragedy, ecstasy and agony. So you have to tell it all. And the writers of history manipulated facts to the point, as I shared with you, you can have a PhD with honors in Virginia history and not know enough about Virginia's indigenous people to fill a page. I wonder how many people tonight had heard about the Massacre of the Paspahegh or the Treaty of 1614, which were pretty significant events in the life not only of the colony, but of its indigenous peoples. So, and Walter Plecker, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him. He ended up altering birth certificates and death records, and midwives delivered a baby, and then if the clerk registered these babies as Indians, they were subject to a year in jail and a fine. My mom and dad went to Washington, D.C. to marry in 1935 because it was against the law to marry as an Indian in Virginia. And again, we didn't get any help from the church or the colleges or the governmental structures. So we had to go under the radar screen to even marry. And some folks were married by the clerk of the U.S. House of Representatives. But when they came back to Virginia, they came back illegally. And that wasn't addressed until the Loving case in 1967. So we lived under a cloud until the courts intervened in 1967. In 1934, John Collier from the Bureau of Indian Affairs called down to the state, and he spoke to somebody from the Bureau of Vital Records, and he said, "We have lived with the Chickahominy people. We know their history and their culture, and we want to, in this Indian reorganization, we want to include them as federally recognized tribes." And a very terse reply from Walter Plecker is, "There are no Indians in Virginia." So what saved us from just total annihilation by the pen is that many white people claimed relationship or kinship with Pocahontas. And they said, "Look, we have a one drop, but we're not colored." So Even that far down the road, Pocahontas helped us out. But let me pause. I'm a person of color. I'm proud of that. So I'm a colored person, no matter how you look at it. But don't take away the Indian designation and replace it with something else. I think all of us should be proud of our ancestry, and I am. But the tribe struggled hard to provide an education for our people. Let me tell you, in 1974, when I received my degree from, the diploma, I wasn't going to the exercise because to me that was just kind of anticlimactic. But Dad said, "Son, will you go?" And he was there, and it was worth it to me when I descended the platform, and there he was with tears streaming down his face, the first child in his family to obtain a 4-year degree. It was very powerful. We built our schools, we paid for our teachers, and at one point, the state decided they would help us out, but only to the 8th grade. And after the 8th grade, our kids went to Oklahoma or Michigan or North Carolina or Kansas to go to school. The Commonwealth would give us a one-way ticket and tuition to those institutions of higher learning, which back then it was in 9th grade through the 12th grade. So it was less than a subtle hint. A one-way ticket, maybe you won't come back. 1952 students applied at then MCV nursing school, and they were referred to the University of Minnesota. They said, "We have facilities for Negroes," is what they said then, "and for whites, but we don't have facilities for Virginia's indigenous peoples, but we found a place that would gladly accept you, the University of Minnesota." And I sit on the Institute for Diversity with the American Hospital Association. One of my peers on there was a dean at the University of Minnesota. And he said, "Chief, we'll take as many as you want to send today." So, but that really, that's a thorn in my side. I mean, I think VCU needs to step up and say, "Look, folks, there are ways we can address what happened to you as we move forward, providing education for aspiring medical students or others." I mentioned to you the fact that there were some bone fragments that we sent for checking, and they go back to 8600. I'll bring it up again to you. So if you want to go online and just type in Chickahominy Look Back or the College of William and Mary Looks Back, and you'll see documentation on that I believe you would find very interesting. 1978, we began a quest for state recognition. We had been operating the Title IV Indian Education Program, and there were several criteria. One criterion is you must be state recognized or federally recognized. And we said, sure, we're state recognized. Well, they called the state, and the state said, we don't have any recognized tribes, despite the fact that tribes had been paying tribute since 1646, and there were 2 reservations, the oldest reservation in the United States in King William County. So we began a process for federal recognition, and the Virginia Commission on Indians was established in 1983, and outgrowth of the mission. Those tribes at that point were the Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Rappahannock, and Upper Mattaponi. And then we began our successful track toward federal acknowledgement. The state legislature wrote, they signed a statement saying they supported it. And then let me back up a minute. The Island administration, through executive order, demanded that the state institutions go back and correct all of the birth records that were altered, which was a pretty signal event. But we began the federal recognition process in 1999, and ironically, the director of the Office of Federal Acknowledgement, back then it was the Bureau of Administration and Research, said you may get federal recognition, but many of you here today will not live long enough to see it. Yeah. And many of those folks did pass away. But we continued and we persevered. In January the 29th, 2018, Public Law 115-121 was signed into law by then President Trump. And and had he not signed it, he signed it at 7 o'clock at 11:59 that night, had he not signed it, it would have gone into law anyway, under what they call a pocket veto. So he had to either sign it or veto it for it not to become law. Doing nothing, it would become law. Since then, we have done a lot of things to help our tribe with Indian Health Services. We've gone through and lots of homes now have potable water. They have septic systems that work. We're providing meals to some of the elderly and shut-in people. We've take people for doctor's appointments into the pharmacy. Folks are able to compete for scholarships that from which they were excluded prior to federal recognition. There are many scholarships that only are available for federally recognized tribes. But when you ask who are we, I think we're very passionate people. I think we're compassionate. And at the end of the day, we have a lot of tenacity. We persevered, and I think through the grace and will of God, we gained federal acknowledgement as a sovereign nation. But it's not over, because the Commonwealth does not understand the state-to-state relationship that we have. There's 7 sovereign nations within the Commonwealth of Virginia, able to write our own laws, able to do all of our, we have both civil and criminal jurisdiction if we choose to act on it. And I've taken all the time that I should take, but I want to at least give you some idea of who we are today. The church does remain a vital part of our community. I'm a deacon, and I've been a Sunday school teacher since I was like 23 years old. It's probably time for me to sit down. I'm beginning to think that I really know what I'm talking about, I reckon. But at the end of the day, there's a lot to learn.
I wondered if I could ask one more question, because you have 2 passionate educators as your conversation partners here, and you've brought up the education piece and faith a lot. So I wondered if you've talked a bit about some of the wonderful work that you're doing for your people and your passion and your tenacity. So you guys as a people have had this tenacity built into your deep Christian faith. What does your faith tell you, the rest of us who are Christian, who are maybe have not been on the same journey? What can we do to ally in this sort of educative process? Like, what does our faith require of us to do in this cultural moment?
I think if we embrace the principles espoused by Christ, those other things are going to naturally accrue. But I think there needs to be an overt push by the citizens of the Commonwealth to have our history books written to include the narrative of Indigenous people, the African Americans, and even those other ethnicities who have come here in some pretty large numbers. They need to be part of today's Virginia history. Yes. And we have the resources to do it, but there's not a will out there to do it. I think had we taught, we're taught, we learn what we're taught, and sometimes we learn things that aren't true. But if Virginia's history had been accurately taught, Charlottesville wouldn't have occurred. Yeah. I think people who are presented with facts, by and large, come to a fairly close consensus on what a path forward should look like. To be sure, there'll be outliers. There'll be the 5% way extreme on the one side and the 5% on the other. But typically, there'll be enough to kind of move us all toward the middle. And I do see a thirst for knowledge in the emerging generation. I think they're not satisfied with the status quo. And I don't think they're going to be content to be spoon-fed. They have tools that will let them go and explore those books that weren't put on the bookshelves in the school libraries and that weren't approved textbooks. So,
and yet I
think the tide is turning.
Some parents of those that might be less curious, as the phrase critical race theory keeps getting thrown around as a sort of a wedge issue or a leverage point for not doing what you're suggesting, not telling the stories of people of color from their point of view.
That's analogous. That's analogous to what one of my dear old friends has passed away. He said, son, if we want to have changes in the church, some of the dear old saints have to pass on to glory. So some of those naysayers will, you know, attrition will take care of them. Some of them will never change. And there's a fear, I believe, that if minorities become the majority, that we'll treat the folks the way they've treated us for the years. My wife and I were in Coogan, New Mexico, driving a new car, and the police officer stopped us. My wife was driving, and she's usually very meek, but she was ticked because cars were passing. She said, "Why did you stop us? We weren't speeding." First thing he asked is, "Whose car is this?" He wanted her driver's license, my driver's license. Went back to his car, came back. He said, "It is your car." And I stopped at the next service station, and I said, "I don't understand it." He said, "Where have you been? You're an Indian, and if you're driving a new car, you stole it." So some of that stuff is still out there.
Yeah.
But I do believe that there are folks that are going to resist. But by and large, the story is going to be told, and maybe critical race theory is the wrong thing to call it, but I think I've demonstrated very clearly tonight that racism against the indigenous people or the indigenous peoples, not only in the United States, but in the United States, it was etched into law under the hand of Chief Justice John Marshall, who lived to regret some of the decisions he made. He said, the question was posed to whom does this land belong to? Who does this land belong to? Ended on a preposition, I apologize, I'm an English professor, but he said from a purist perspective, it belongs to the indigenous peoples. But I don't think they have the intellectual capacity to be good stewards of all those resources that they have. And I say, not too kindly, I'd love for him to drink a cup of water from the combined sewer overflow in Richmond after a nice rain. And that'll let him know who the stewards of the environment really were. 400 years has really wrought havoc on the pristine environment that survived for many years before 1607.
Chief, we have time for maybe one more question. There's a good one that just came up in our Q&A, and I'd like to read it to you.
Okay.
And just get your take on it. I think it'll bring us back to where we started from as you reflected upon the miracle that came over into your life as you found Christianity. This person writes, "I come from a native Hawaiian family. Many of our kings and queens became Christian, and there's a beautiful tradition of hymns and prayers written by our people. At the same time, I sometimes feel sad about the culture and religion that were there before and were lost. I wonder if you feel that sort of sadness sometimes, despite being Christian. If so, how do you reconcile it? I love the way you talk about Christianity among your people as a miracle from God."
Yeah, and that's a very positive, I mean, it's a great question. It's very positive. And I do wrestle with it sometimes. But what gets me closer is looking at how closely my religion parallels Christianity. And typically when I offer prayer, I'll start off, Mushe Wanato, Cheske, Mushe Wanato, Cheske the K Wat, Woshawa Womanana, which means Great Spirit, loving Father of all creation. And when I thought about my fellow brothers and sisters in Hawaii, and I've really done a lot of studying on, Kamehameha and all of the things that happened, when the Doles and the Del Montes came over and just trashed the land and took it from its indigenous people. So I understand that disconnect, but I think as I've grown and matured, I know that God allows things to happen that really aren't His intentional will. If I leave here tonight and somebody runs over me and kills me, I hope it doesn't happen. If it does, I know where I'm going. I don't think God said, "I'm gonna get Steve tonight." I think things happen that I don't think He has our lives scripted. I really don't. And that's a rambling answer, but I've struggled sometimes to reconcile those two. But as I mature in my faith, I recognize, I believe that God's intentional will is that none should perish. And I think the way to salvation is through Jesus Christ.
Thank you.
That's a great question. I'd love to talk to the questioner. So if you guys want to give him my email, you can. He or she, I'm sorry. the individual.
Absolutely. I'm sure we can make that connection. It looks like we lost Dave, but I hope he'll be back in a moment. So he was going to sort of formally thank you, Chief Adkins, and I will step in and do that. And thank you for your generous time of sharing your story, of spending your time with us, of being willing to answer our questions and make them such a meaningful dialogue, and talking and answering with those who submitted questions. So we are deeply grateful for your time and your conversation here. So thank you very much.
And as I said, I was humbled to be here, so thank you.
No, this is an absolute treat. I'm so grateful personally. And we are grateful to all of you who have joined us out there. We appreciate you listening in and participating in our conversation tonight. As was mentioned at the opening, this is just the first of what we hope will be many conversations, sort of thinking about different topics in relationship to faith and culture. So I wanted to bring to your attention, our next talk is on Wednesday, November 10th with the Reverend Jess Cook, and it's going to be a conversation on faith and the LGBTQ plus community. Reverend Jess Cook is a minister in the Presbyterian Church USA, currently in the process of starting a new church community in Richmond here. Jess loves people, liturgy that means something, and spaces that invite us to bring our whole selves. Jess actually also lives in Richmond with their partner, kiddo, 2 dogs, 1 cat, and apparently a bearded dragon named Stubbs. So I do hope that you guys will also join us for that conversation, which I greatly hope will be as lively and wonderful as this evening's has been with Chief Adkins. And with that, I will take the last few seconds to close us with a prayer. So I spoke to Chief Adkins about this before, but I wanted to try to find something that was translated out of Algonquin to make these sort of links. So it is a prayer that mentions the Great Spirit, which Chief Adkins was just offering some of that beautiful language to us. So if you will. The Great Spirit is in all things. He is in the air we breathe. The Great Spirit is our Father, but the earth is our mother. She nourishes us, that which we put into the ground, she returns to us. And I hope that we will take that prayer as an invitation to think about our relationships to the land in new ways, and in allyship with those who came before us here and have been on Turtle Island much longer than us. So, amen and thank you.
I bid you all a good night.